Welcome to CEC Live. Good afternoon to everybody. And today we are going to concentrate on one specific text by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The text is The German Ideology. Those who have been following this text series would be aware that we are paying a lot of attention on reading the text very carefully, line by line, focusing on the exact words that the authors have written and trying to see and interpret their meaning in the context that they wrote in, as well as look at the relevance of their writings in contemporary times. It may seem odd in a certain sense that we in 2018, middle of 2018, are looking at a text, The German Ideology, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which was written in the fall of 1845 to the mid-1846, published way back in 1932, that why should we take up a text written so many years ago, more than a century and a half years ago? What is its relevance? This is the point that I would like to begin with, that why do we take so many of these classical texts, whether it be Karl Marx, whether it be Max Weber, whether it be Emily Durkheim, and talk about it not only many centuries apart, but also physically located as we are in India, that what would the relevance of a text like this be? A couple of points is very important here to emphasize. The first point being, as these were writers, particularly a scholar like Karl Marx, was emphasizing upon the transformations that were taking place in the Western world in the context of the rise of capitalism as a dominant social formation. 2018 remains a world where capitalism is the dominant social formation. What Karl Marx was also looking at that period of time is that how social sciences ought to study society. What are the theories and methods of inquiry which would be important to look at social sciences in a particular fashion, which would be able, in a certain sense, to affirm a certain objective perspective? How do we break away from the ideas which dominate our consciousness and go to what he calls the material basis of social life? So both the relevance of a persisting form of capitalism, a formation which has transformed radically in the decades that has taken place, but still defined by division of labor, division of property, by issues of inequality and uneven growth and development. Those issues remain today. Likewise, the issue of objectivity, the issue of subjectivity, how do we minimize the influence of our ideas which tend to cloud or camouflage the manner in which we look to reality, remains persistent today in social sciences, and even more persistent in a world dominated by the media, where a culture of fake news and a culture which emphasizes that it's all about perception and nothing more, it becomes extremely relevant to go back to an old text like German Ideology. What is German Ideology about? German ideology refers to those thinkers which were dominant in Germany, in German philosophy at the time of Marx. Now, Marx had a certain kind of critical position vis-a-vis those German idealists or those German scholars who he felt erred or made a mistake in looking at society through the lens of ideas and not entering into the actual lives of human beings as they lived in their everyday lives. So here in German Ideology, he is opposing materialist and idealist outlook. A large section of the book is basically looking at the distinction that he makes between what he advocates a materialist interpretation of history, a materialist interpretation of society as against an idealist interpretation of society. I begin with the first premise of what he articulates as the materialist method. What is this materialist method? The premises from which we begin are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real processes from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on what does this mean. He says that, look, very often we start from the ideas or conceptions that we already have as members of society when we try to analyze society. For example, we already have a conception of the family. We already have a conception of marriage. We already have a conception of religion. We already have a conception of people who we may think are more meritorious and people who we think are not. We have conceptions of merit. We have conceptions of competition. We have conceptions of disparity. We have conception of who is lazy, who is not lazy. Our whole social lives are dominated by these concepts. The point that Marx is trying to make here when he says the premises from which we begin are not arbitrary is the point that we can't just begin from any random ideas that we may have, random idea of family or religion or polity or economy, but we have to begin from where human beings are really there. They are the real individuals, as I, as you, as all of us are located in a certain social formation. We have to begin with the real individual, their activity and the material conditions under which they live, both those which they find already existing and those produced by their activity. These premises can thus be verified in a purely empirical way. This is a very, very small paragraph, but a very important paragraph to understand what is it that he is saying. He is saying that, look, let us not go into the idea of human beings or the idea of a woman or the idea of a man. Let us concentrate on who are these individuals. Who is this individual who is a kisan, a farmer who is tilling his land? What is his activity? His activity is to till the land and cultivate the land. This is the land. This is the conditions, the material conditions under which the kisan lives. What is my work? My work is the teacher. My work is primarily in the material conditions of a classroom, very different from the material conditions of a kisan. These conditions define who I am. These conditions define the kind of products that we produce. The kisan produces through her hard labor, the crops that they grow. The labor which I put in is different. It's an intellectual labor. It's a communicative labor, very, very different. But both of us are defined by productive activities. So the first lesson that is being taught in German ideology is that, supposing hypothetically you have to study any group of individuals in any society, the first point is not to ask who are these people or what are their beliefs or what are their attitudes, the kind of thing which a lot of market research does today, but to ask who are these people, what is the material conditions under which they live, under which they produce, and what is this that they produce. So where do we start when we start the study of any society? The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. The first fact that's to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. Again, a simple paragraph, but theoretically loaded, theoretically very, very powerful. The point being made is that, look, if I have to study a kisan, if I have to study the lives of the farmer, I have to understand the physical organization of their individuals. As you are aware, in a country like India, the means of production by which the kisan labors have changed in some contexts, in many contexts, but have not changed in many others. So you would have very developed capitalist form of farming, capitalist sugar cultivation, where you would have very new technologies of cultivation. You would have tractors, you would have high irrigation, you would have the use of electricity. So you have a certain physical organization which defines these people. On the other hand, you may still have in some parts of the country shifting cultivation. You may have a slash and burn, that you grow a certain crops, when it's over you burn and you move out. This physical organization defines the relationship of these individuals to the nature which is surrounding them. This is what we mean by a materialist interpretation of history. Very often, especially in the case of Marx, because whereas very few people may have read Marx, the ideas of Marx have traveled far and wide, and there is a lot of misconception about what Marx is. So if you ask anybody what is Marx all about, and they say Marx is an economic determinism. Now if you read Marx, you'll first realize that there's far more to it, and he rarely uses the word economy. What he does use is relations of production, forces of production, mode of production, materialist interpretation of history, which are far more complex and sophisticated tools of understanding human life than to reduce it to a certain kind of elementary notion of what the economy constitutes. The writing of history, he therefore argues, must always set out from the natural basis and the modification in the course of history through the action of men. So he is emphasizing two things. One, the materialist interpretation of history. So materialist, the physical organization, the tools, the technology which defines human production. And the second, that these change over time. These are not fixed entities. They change historically, and they change historically not automatically, but by the means of labor which humans do. So Marx has a very dynamic understanding of human beings. In contemporary terminology, he endows human beings with agency, that human beings are active, laboring individuals, and they transform the world which exists around them. Human beings begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. To give an illustration by what he means by this is that right at the very beginning of human life, when human beings basically would collect their food, maybe pluck a fruit, maybe hunt an animal, they were defined by the knowledge that they had of technology, of nature, and they had to make sure that they got food to eat that is produced for their means of subsistence. But this production for their means of subsistence would be defined primarily by their physical organization. Very different if you do a kind of cut short and say in contemporary times working in a very highly developed, technologically developed situation, maybe in a laboratory, maybe in space research, the physical organization would be completely different. And then a very important point, by producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. So as we interact with nature, as we act upon nature, as we cut forests and make this agricultural land, not only are we acting upon nature to get our subsistence, but we are also producing and reproducing the actual material life. The ways in which men produce their means of subsistence depends first on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and then have to reproduce. What we find, the actual means vary from one point of time to another. So when Marx was writing the German ideology in the middle of the 19th century, he wouldn't have been typing his writings in a computer, but he would be scratching on a pen, on a paper, and in fact If you look at the original German ideology, the editors mention that a lot of the notes would have been cancelled out because he's writing a paper. It would be very, very different. We have to operate upon the basis which exists at our point of time, and as we work upon it, we can also transform and reproduce what is happening. The mode of production, all of you would be familiar with this term, mode of production in Marxist theory. What does it mean? The mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individual. It is more than that. It is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. I find this paragraph fascinating because very often people have the understanding of Marx as an economic determinist is somebody who would have very little sense of how complex the mode of production is. The mode of production is not a simple economics, whatever that may mean. It is how we live our life, what we produce, with what we produce what, our mode of life, how we live, our expressions. So if you live in a village, in a simple village where the means of subsistence are limited, maybe a simple, what we call in anthropology, a simple society, or if you like to use in quotes, a tribal society where people really produce for means of subsistence, their lives would be hard. But their lives would not be driven by the kind of assertive competitiveness which marks late capitalism of 21st century as we exist in our urban life, where people are driven to compete, are driven to excel, are driven to make sure that they reach their goalposts faster than the others. This is the mode of production as it exists today. This defines the competitive spirit, not just defines the economic life, but it defines everything. All of you are familiar with young children growing up in small towns, big cities, where parents are constantly telling them to excel, to diversify, to compete. We once lived at a point of time where we would sing for the simple joy of it, to express our inner soul, our inner lives. We had one point of time where people, dancers, music would be reflecting the seasonal flux of time. So people would harvest festival would be marked by cooking of certain kind of food, by harvest, dance forms which would be celebrating harvest, by music and songs which would celebrate harvesting. Today we have music very often understood in terms of the kind of many music contests that we have on television. So many people that I talk to in everyday life tell me that their children are training or being geared to a competition to come on television, maybe a certain kind of excelling of, by which they can then move up in life, might compete and move forward. You are familiar with that kind of mode of production expressing itself. So mode of production is a far more complex term than just economy as understood. I really don't know what exactly they mean by economy, but in the case of Marx, economy is always political economy. Economy is always a form of expression, a cultural economy. It's a physical organization. It's social relations between people. Social relations between people who are located in the same class situation as against others who may be located in another situation. To this point of differentiation, I'll come to a little later. As individuals express their lives, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with what they produce, both with what they produce and with how they produce. Read these texts and recall the example I gave you just a little while back about the competitive musical competitions on television as compared to an older form of harvest festivals. And the point that I was trying to say that Marx was trying to look at the composite or the holistic way in the manner in which we look at individuals and society, and connect the physical, the productive aspect of human beings with their expressive aspects. I'll give a very simple example which hopefully all of you could relate to. Now, if you would recall, whether it's in Hindi films or any other Indian films or maybe even English films, particularly older films, you would always see a contrast between the person who comes to the village, a person who comes from the rural areas to the city, and the bewilderment of the villager in the city, because in the village, the villager doesn't have to really dodge traffic, stop at red light, get bound by the logistics of an urban city life. They can just wander, meander, cross a river, sit inside and put their feet in water, or go to the field, run around, do whatever they feel. But when you come to the city, you are constrained by the logic of the manner in which a city is planned, and by the logic of a certain urgency and time-bound pattern which city dwellers have. You have to reach office at a particular point of time. The factory siren is on. Everybody is in a rush. I recall even as a child coming from a small town to the big city, that what the first thing that struck us was that everybody was in a rush. This is the point that Marx is trying to explain when he says, as individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. Now, you would recall I mentioned the question of class. I just touched upon it because very often the tendency when discussing Marx is to first go and say that Marx said that there are different classes in society. But before Marx reached that point, he was trying to make a larger and a more complex theoretical point, that to understand how human society is created and how labor and activity are extremely central to human life. This section is called Production and Intercourse, Division of Labor and Forms of Property. The various stages of development in the division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership. That is, the existing stage in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instrument and product of labor. I'll spend a little bit of time on this. Those of you, and I think the text on Durkheim has already been conveyed to you. Durkheim also had a text called The Division of Labor. So all the scholars who were talking about modernity and the kind of transformation which was taking place with the birth of capitalism were realizing that from a simple, we are moving to a complex society. From a society where everybody was roughly the same, we are moving to a certain society where there's more specialized labor and greater intensification. But whereas Durkheim stopped at that point, Marx brings in another element to this argumentation, arguing that the different forms of labor are actually different forms of ownership. At the first round, it may seem a little strange because we are not normally used to the idea of division of labor being many different forms of ownership. But let's spell it out and take examples. For example, in a society which is property based, like our society is, many of us who belong to the middle class may have some property. Many of us who belong to even a lower middle class may have some little bit of land somewhere, maybe a little home somewhere, but some form of private property. There would be others who may have no land at all, and there may be others who have no homes at all. That is, no form of property. Now, depending upon whether we have property or not property, our labor or our division, the kind of work we do, would be very, very different. Now, if I belong hypothetically to a society to a family which had no property, no land, no house, homeless, maybe somebody who was reduced to begging in the streets of the metropolitan cities which dot India. Maybe people who are just begging on the streets, trying to stop a car, trying to stop a person. Now that comes from the fact that you have no other access to resources or property which would enable you to go and till a little crop of land, maybe have certain kind of skills which would allow you to go and sell your labor somewhere. So, depending upon your location in society and the kind of access and ownership of property you have, your labor would be defined. So, the child who belongs to a completely impoverished family would have to labor from very early. So, a 3-year-old child, you may have seen, would be carrying a baby brother or a baby sister in their arms. Maybe start collecting twigs along with their mother for their fuel. A 3-year-old child of a propertied family, even if it's not too much property, will be preparing to go to school. So, depending upon property, there would be division of labor. Now, coming back to what he is saying, the various stages of development in the division of labor are just many different forms of ownership. The existing stage in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to material, instrument and product of labor. So, our access to education, our access to cultural achievements, what you would call cultural capital, our habits of whether we read books, whether we are exposed to fine arts, whether we are exposed to fine dance forms, aesthetics, paintings, would be defined by where we are located in the division of property. Now we shift. Remember, there are two aspects to historical materialism of Marx. One is the concentration on the material formation, and by now you would realize the material is far more complex than just the physical, than just the economic. It's basically about social relations of production, which includes technology, which includes social organization. So this formation changes from one point of history to another point of history. So, the first that he begins is the tribal form of ownership. The first form of ownership is tribal ownership. It corresponds to the undeveloped stage of production at which people live by hunting, by fishing, by rearing of beasts, or in the highest stage, agriculture. So, you don't do anything more complicated than that. In a certain sense, your relationship to nature is not as mediated as our relationship in the 21st century is. Hunting, fishing, rearing of beasts, or in the highest stage of agriculture. Now, if you have a pure form, what Weber would call an ideal type, then the tribal form of ownership would then naturally get, get back to, get transformed to, completely to maybe a feudal form of production. But in our societies, in a country like India, you would notice that very often the tribal form of production coexists with very sophisticated capitalist form of production. So, even today in our country, we have pastoral communities who would graze their sheep or cattle in the lower climes, come down from the mountains, and when it is summer, go back with their cattle up there. You would still have what would be called the burn and of cultivation, what is called that you sort of grow your crops, and when the crops are grown, you just burn it and move on to another land. But historically, in many parts of the developed world, or hypothetically the developed world, the tribal forms were completely replaced by another form of production. And that form of production is broadly what would be called a feudal form of production. But perhaps a little more about what this kind of tribal form of production was. The tribal form of ownership here presupposes that you would have large uncultivated stretches of land. Here it is elementary, And very often the division of labor in a tribal society would be within the family. For example, the point that I made about the little 3-year-old child carrying their little baby brother or sister, because the mother may have to go out and work, or the father may have to go out and work. A 4-year-old little girl may help their mother in cooking, because they have to get into the division of labor very early in a time. So here the division of labor is very often within the family. The social structure is therefore limited to an extension of the family. Patriarchal family chieftains, below them the members of the tribe, and finally slaves. So here the family itself organizes it. So when you say the patriarchal head, very often when we talk in North Indian system, they would say the head of the family, the Tao, that you ask his permission for before you do certain here. Here again you notice Marx's careful attention to organization, not just to physical organization, but social organization. You also notice his introduction of the term patriarchal family chieftains. That is not matriarchal family chieftain, because this family is very often patriarchal. The line of descent now slowly becomes through from the father to the son, etc. Here he makes a certain point, could be contested, but very important. The slavery latent in the family develops gradually with the increase of population, growth of wants, and with the extension of external relation, both of war and barter. So right at the beginning, elementary subsistence development, and as it gets more, maybe with the increase of population, maybe with certain growth of wants, you have maybe relationship with other communities, neighbors, other tribes, maybe it would be conquest and war, maybe it would be barter, but you have a more complex formation which starts taking place. From there, he moves to what he calls the ancient communal ownership. And this ancient communal ownership proceeds from the union of several tribes into a city by agreement or by conquest, and is still accompanied by slavery. By slavery, that is, certain section of people are completely under the control of another set of people. And as you are familiar, slavery has varied from historical period to another. The kind of slavery we are more familiar with is the kind of slavery which was established by the Americans when they got into slave trade, got people from Africa to run their plantations. But the nature of slavery very often shifted from one point of time to another. So you may have a question where from India itself we had people not called slave, but indentured labor with the British during the British period, where they exported them to run their sugar plantations or cotton plantations in distant Africa, in distant Latin America. So you have here slowly the division of labor becoming more intense, because the division of property also becomes more intense. Along with it, you notice that here, as the world expands and production expands, you start having more global forms of production taking place. These are the first points which are being delineated, that how do we start understanding a society? How do we start understanding an individual if we don't look at its past, at its history, and look at the mode of production within which they operate? How do we understand an Indian descendant, what we call people of Indian origin, from Suriname in South America, if we don't go back to the history of British imperialism and colonialism and their institutionalized form of slavery? So history is important, material forms of production is important. Besides communal ownership, we also find movable and then immovable private property developing, but as an abnormal form subordinate to communal ownership. Here he is talking about a historical period very remote from our time, where you have private property developing, but also subordinate to communal ownership, because in many ancient societies the control would be on the community. You would be familiar with the word commons. Very often we argue that water was a common good, that everybody could access water, access land, access air. A lot of conflict between tribal access to common land and then private ownership of land, and then modern legal instruments to bar those people from entering forests reflect the kind of tensions which take place. It also takes us back to an earlier period of time when we mentioned in the course of discussing German ideology that as human beings act upon nature, societies start getting transformed. Nature gets transformed. The world that we come into gets transformed not just automatically but through the active intervention of human beings. Debates on, say, global warming today is not something which has just happened without human intervention and human agency, but with human intervention and with human agencies. In the olden period that Marx is talking about, the citizens hold power over their laboring slaves only in their community, and on this account they are bound to the forms of communal ownership. But as society changes, you start having a tension between communal ownership and private property. This is the point which is very central to Marx's theory, that as society keeps advancing, division of labor intensifies, forms of property change, technology advances, means of production change, you would have tensions between social relations of production and the forces of production. Social relations of production meaning, in this case, the communal ownership, and the mode of production that you increasingly have a form of production which prioritizes private property. Now, if this is there, there's bound to be a conflict between an older form of relations of production, older communal form of production, and new forms. You can see the tension, say, between people who are landed and the customs and beliefs of the family who belongs to a landed community, saying the land is our life, the land is our izzat, the land is our honor, the land is our culture. And you may have a new generation in the times of global capitalism who would say, let's sell off this land and let's move into real estate business. And there may be a tension between the younger generation and the older generation, or we may have films about it. But if you're a social scientist, we can't study this tension between the two generations as something which is only a generational conflict or a conflict between contesting ideas. But what we have to look at is that these ideas itself are part of the material forms of production. So the feudal forms of ownership which take over from the ancient forms of ownership is the kind of descriptions I've just been giving you. Landed, we are very familiar with feudalism in our country. We had large forms, the zamindari system. After the abolition of zamindaris, continued persistence of large tracts of land which may be then under new owners, but a certain sense of an identification of land with feudalism, a certain kind of property which should continue from one generation to another. But with the coming in of global capitalism, real estate buzz, urbanization, you may have a contest between earlier ideas and old ideas. I finally come towards the tail end of the argument that Marx has been making, and I would like to sort of dwell on it, that where do ideas come from? Now, in this example that I gave you of about contending ideas between the younger generation who would want to sell their property and move in to real estate business, and an older generation who would say, this is my land, how can I sell it? Now, this contending ideas do not emerge from nowhere. That is the basic point that Marx is making. That when he says materialist conception of history, social being and social consciousness, the fact that he says the definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations. So at a particular point of time, what was important in feudalism is that land or property runs from the patriarch of one generation to the patriarch of another generation. In another situation, the community matters, the family matters, kinship matters. In the new form of capitalist entrepreneurship, the individual matters, individual competition matters, individual achievements matter. Now here Marx says that you can see empirically by watching, by analyzing, not get caught up about mystification and speculation, not get caught up in plain ideas as though ideas are not rooted in human life. He says ideas, the social structure, the state, the ideas all evolve out of the life process of definite individuals not as we imagine them in our or other people's imagination, but as they really are, as they operate, produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions and conditions independent of their will. That is, I can't tell my child, relax, that is all right, you don't have to compete. I am dominated by the dominant ideas of society, and the dominant idea of a capitalist society is competition and individual achievement. Those ideas become part of our life, they're part of our expression. Ideas, conception and material activity, the production of ideas, of conception, of consciousness are therefore directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. You would of course notice Marx, like many other scholars of his time, would use men and not women, not humans, and that is again something that as you read text you should be aware of, the context within which they were writing. Conceiving, thinking, mental intercourse are products of human society, yet they appear as though they are divinely ordained. Law, politics, morality, religion, metaphysics, etc. of our people emerge in specific society conditioned by a definite development of their productive forces. So here is the clue to what he means by the material forms of production. Consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence and the existence of men in their actual life process. So when we start analyzing and studying society, very often young people will go and ask, so what do you feel? It's like, the television anchors will say, who will you vote for, or what is your belief system? As a social scientist, Marx's argument is you don't begin with what they say or what they believe, but what you begin with is where they are located in their everyday life production. In direct contrast to German philosophy, which Marx is critiquing, we begin from earth to heaven. We don't descend from heaven to earth. That is, we say we do not set out from what human beings say, imagine, conceive, nor from human beings as narrated, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at human beings in flesh. We begin from real active women and men, and on the basis of their real life process, we demonstrate the development of ideological reflexes. The beliefs that we have, and I remember I began by saying if I am a teacher, I am defined by the material context within which I am located. The ideas that I have about a good life reflect the kind of production situation within which we are. And ideas have to have history, they have to have development. And the problem with an idealist perspective, they look at ideas as though they have no history, no development, but men developing their material prediction do actually produce. Life is not determined by consciousness. Consciousness is determined by life. Last point, and I'll hurry here, is the idea of ideology, that very often the dominant ideas of society, the dominant ideas of the ruling class become the dominant ideas of any particular period. So the ruling class in a capitalist society are capitalists. Their idea is competition, entrepreneurship, profit making, do well in life, compete, if necessary, buy off, destroy your competitor, those ideas become dominant in our lives. So whereas the businessman may be trying to buy off a competitor, in our own little classroom, a student may be trying to hide her or his notes, hoping that they do better than their competitor. The ruling ideas become dominant in society. This dominant, whereas in a feudal society, maybe competition was not the dominant idea. It didn't have the kind of drive which defines our contemporary life. So here, as I come to the end, I want to just sort of end by showing that the whole question is that when we study society, we can't begin with anything which is just arbitrary. We have to begin with real people, real life, real production, not just the physical organization, technology, life as it exists in the real sense of the term. I end over here. Thank you very much.